The popularity of dried tomatoes started in California with California cuisine and has moved to Oklahoma via newspapers, magazines, and visits to the coast itself. Now, the problem with California's dried tomatoes as an ingredient is that they're really expensive. A little package like this, which is about 3 ounces in weight, costs about $2.30. So it's nothing to laugh at when you're adding it to a recipe. However, we can make these at home if you have a dehydrator, if you've got a good supply of hot, sunny days, or even if you have an oven available to you. This is something we can do. Now, in order to do this, we want to start with the right variety of tomatoes. The reason that we choose Roma or a real good cooking variety of tomatoes is several-fold. One is that this type of tomato is much higher in solids. When I cut this tomato, the juice is not going to run everywhere because it's got about 15% solids, as opposed to a slicing tomato where you'll have probably about 6% solids, which means I can leave these in bigger pieces or in similar size pieces and have a whole lot more tomato left when it's dry. I'm going to simply cut these in half and put them on dehydrator trays. Now, if you're doing this at home and you've got a jury-rig trays to do it out in the sun or in your oven, make sure that you don't use aluminum trays because tomatoes are very acidic and they'll eat through that aluminum for you. We're going to leave the peel on, which makes it even simpler. I did core them, and if you find you have any white hard parts near the core, you'd want to cut those off also. And I made sure that they were real clean before we started because dehydration will not make anything cleaner than what it starts with. Now, this is simply putting them in there close together but not touching. They could simply go in the dehydrator like this. However, there's some other things that you can do to enhance flavor. Some people like to sprinkle them lightly with salt, and that will pull some of the moisture out and actually enhance the speed the drying process along a little bit. However, remember, anytime you use salt, you're also going to be adding a lot of sodium, and you add a lot of salty taste so that later on when you come back to use it, you may have more salt there than you want. One thing I am going to do, however, is sprinkle them with a little bit of herbs. Now, I'm using an Italian mixture of basil and marjoram and oregano. You could use whatever you have. One thing to remember, however, is that if you're using fresh herbs, make sure that they're clean as well, so that when the drying process starts, you're not going to be having more microorganisms there than you need to worry about. Heavy loads of microorganisms at this point may end up with mold and spoilage later on when the food's actually dry and in storage. These then go into the dehydrator. Now, if you have a dehydrator, you're at an advantage as opposed to sun and oven because you can control temperature more, particularly if you have one with a thermostat. We want to set the thermostat at about 140 degrees and leave it at that temperature for at least 10 hours before you really come back to do much checking. There is one thing you can do after 4 hours, however, in that after 4 hours with the dehydrator going, come back and you can flatten them a little bit, and that will perhaps release, there tends to be a film that forms over the top during dehydration that breaks that up a little bit and lets the moisture out. Also, I'd recommend that you turn them over simply to let more air circulate on the other side. This then goes on until the 10 hours is done at least. Then you start checking as you approach that 10 hours for doneness. It may take 15 hours if you have to break in the night. If you are sun drying, for instance, it may take as long as 3 days. With an oven, cracking the oven open means that you're going to be actually heating your house as well because you've got to let that heat out of the oven to let the air circulate. So that will add a lot of hotness to your house and make your air conditioner run more as well. So that's the reason that method is not as much of choice. When they're done, they're going to look similar to these, which are some that I dried. Now, I started with 15 pounds of tomatoes and got them down so that they all fit in 1 quart jar. They'll be leathery, pliable, very similar to a dried apricot. You'll get a good full color if you started with good tomatoes. If you start with tomatoes from the grocery store that have been picked pre-ripe or that are too ripe to start with, you'll get a much paler color. So vine-ripened tomatoes from your own garden are going to work much better. These then you're going to store. A small freezer bag that's got a date on it works extremely well. It's important, if all possible, to get just a small amount that you'll use within 1 or 2 openings because every time you open it, you allow moisture, bacteria to get into the container, and the quality is going to deteriorate. Date it. And then put it into storage. Now, the best storage is going to be in some place cool, dry, and dark. And the colder you get, the longer it's going to keep. So for maximum length of storage, package them in something like this, small bags, put them inside a solid container, and put them in your freezer for the longest storage or refrigerator. The least acceptable choice will be at room temperature. It will really cut your storage time down substantially on these. Now, one thing we would encourage you not to do is to cover them with oil for storage. A lot of people do this. A lot of recipes call for them. You can buy them commercially. The problem with the commercial ones, or the difference between the commercial ones and the ones at home, is that they have an acidulant added to them. Just like with water bath canning, where we don't really know the acidity of tomatoes when we're water bath canning, and so we make sure we do it for any length of time. If you don't have enough acid in these tomatoes, you cover them with oil, you then have an anaerobic or an oxygen-free environment, and botulism toxin can actually be produced under those conditions. So you may actually cause food poisoning, severe, deadly food poisoning, if you cover them with oil. If you are going to do it, make sure that you do it within the day that you're going to use them. Store it in the refrigerator and use it up within 2 to 3 days at the most. And if you have some left at that point, you need to discard it. An alternative to make salad dressings that are flavored with the tomatoes would be to cover them with vinegar. The vinegar is very acid. You'll, in essence, be pickling them. They will keep for a much longer time, and you can use the vinegar to make salad dressings, to add to stir fries, and to things like that. They are a very tasteful product, something that you'll enjoy trying. Try mixing them in breads in your bread machine or by hand. Most of the time we rehydrate them a little bit before we use them in stir fries or on gourmet pizza, in bread products also, otherwise they pull too much of the liquid away from the flour and so on. Go ahead and give it a try. I think you're really going to like this one. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. You can also find more recent videos on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.